deprecating the phrase. "At our age," said Mrs. Maldon, with slow insistence, "we ought not to be hard on others. We ought to be thinking of our own sins." But although Mrs. Maldon was perhaps the one person on earth whom he both respected and feared, Thomas Batchgrew listened to her injunction only with rough disdain. He was incapable of thinking of his own sins, while in health he was nearly as unaware of sin as an animal. Nevertheless, he turned uneasily in the silence of the pale room, so full of the shy and prim refinement of Mrs. Maldon's individuality. He could talk morals to others in the grand manner, and with positive enjoyment, but to be sermonized himself secretly exasperated him, because it constrained him and made him self-conscious. Invariably, when thus attacked, he would execute a flank movement. He said bluntly, "And I suppose you'll let him marry this Rachel girl if he's a mind to?" Slowly a deep flush covered Mrs. Maldon's face. "What makes you say that?" she questioned, with rising agitation. "I have but just seen them together." Mrs. Maldon moved nervously in the bed. "I should never forgive myself if I stood by and let Louis marry Rachel," she said, and there was a sudden desperate urgency in her voice. "Isn't she good enough for a nephew of yours?" "She's good enough for any man," said Mrs. Maldon quietly. "Then it's him as isna good enough. And yet, if he's got such a good side to him, as ye say," Mr. Batchgrew snorted. "He's not suited to her, not at all." "Now, missus," said Mr. Batchgrew in triumph, "at last we're getting down to your real opinion of young Fores." "I feel I'm responsible for Rachel, and what ought I to do about it?" "Do? What can a body do when a respectable young woman with red hair takes a fancy to a youth? Nowt, Elizabeth, that young woman'll marry Louis Fores, and you can take it from me." "But why do you say a thing like that? I only began to notice anything myself last night." "She's lost her head over him, that's all. I caught 'em just now, as thick as thieves in your parlour." "But I'm by no means sure that he's smitten with her." "What does it matter whether he is or not? She's lost her head over him, and she'll have him. It doesn't want a telescope to see as far as that." "Well, then I shall speak to her. I shall speak to her to-morrow morning, after she's had a good night's rest, when I feel stronger." "Ay, ye may. And what shalt say?" "I shall warn her. I think I shall know how to do it," said Mrs. Maldon, with a certain air of confidence and her trouble. "I wouldn't run the risk of a tragedy for worlds." "It's no risk of a tragedy, as ye call it," said Thomas Batchgrew, very pleased with his own situation in the argument. "It's a certainty. She'll believe him afore she believes you, whatever ye say. You mark me, it's a certainty." After elaborate preparations of his handkerchief, he blew his nose loudly, because blowing his nose loudly affected him in an agreeable manner. A few minutes later he left, saying the car would be waiting for him at the back of the town hall, and Mrs. Maldon lay alone until Mrs. Tams came in with a tray. "And I hope that's enough company for one day," said Mrs. Tams. "Now sup it up, do." End of chapter 6.